This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Later this week, I've got a video coming out with some advice for how players can be great guest players at a D&D table. But that might seem like a strange concept to some of you. You can invite people to be guest players? Why would you do that? And how would that even work? So today we're going to try to tackle everything you need to know as a GM about inviting people to play D&D with you as a guest player. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a video, because I've got some bangers coming up soon. You are not going to want to miss those. First of all, let's define our terms. We're talking about when you invite somebody to sit in for a session or a couple of sessions and join a game that's already in progress. So let's start with the obvious question. Why might you do this? What is the appeal of inviting a guest player to your game? Well, generally speaking, there are two factors to this answer. The first is the benefit to your group. The second is the benefit to that guest player. Let's start with the former. Why might you invite a guest to the table to benefit the group? Well, the first answer is probably the most obvious. You need another player to help the party handle the combats and challenges. Maybe one or more regular players can't make it to the session, and you don't want to cancel the game, but you also know the situation will be too difficult with only 2 or 3 players at the table. Maybe the players are in a situation where they just don't have the support they need from their current classes, and so you want to bring in some new blood to help them get through a particularly tough challenge. Honestly, there are all sorts of reasons like that. I've sat in as a player in sessions where the group just didn't have enough people who could make it to that game, so I was invited to fill a seat. And from the GM perspective, I once ran a campaign where the party was going to travel back through the hometown of a player who had actually left the group when she'd moved away. And so I thought, hey, they're going through her hometown. This would be an awesome opportunity to bring that player back for a session since they're in her old stomping grounds. After all, it would be a lot of fun for the group to be back with an old party member. The second answer to the question of why bring in a guest star is to benefit the player. Maybe you or one of the other players has a friend in town, and so you invite them to play just to make sure that they don't feel left out of the plans you already had scheduled. Maybe you have a friend who loves Baldur's Gate 3 and they're interested in trying D&D, but they don't want to commit to a full campaign, so you bring them in for a couple of sessions of your current game. Maybe there's someone you're interested in running a campaign for, but first you want to see them in action and get a feel for what they think of D&D. I brought guests into games simply because they wanted to give D&D a try, or wanted to play with my current group because our old group fell apart. The truth is, there are a dozen reasons why you might ask somebody to come and join your game. But there are also a lot of questions you might need to answer, especially when it comes to the logistics. The first question is simple. How do you recruit guest players? I would say you should focus on the bare minimums. What game are you playing? How long do your sessions last? Do you expect this guest player to come back for more than one session? I think this is the kind of thing that you should always tell your players anyway, but a guest player especially needs to know what's expected of them. If they've never played D&D before and they're expecting something like the length of a board game or maybe the length of a movie, they might be surprised to learn that your D&D games rarely run shorter than 4 hours. Another important piece of info to give them is where you plan to play. Most people are more likely to make their plans around where they're willing to go. If you play at your house all the way at the other side of town and you play from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., then the players need to know that in case they don't have reliable transportation to get there and back. The next question is, where do you find your guest players? And for that, I should say this really isn't any different than if you were trying to find players for a normal group, except you just need to be a little bit more clear with them in advance about how many sessions they'll be a part of. One of my first videos was all about the ways you can potentially find D&D players, so this is a great place to start. But how does a character creation work for a guest player? I think the answer depends on a couple of variables. How familiar the guest is with the system, and how much time you have before the game. If the players are not at all familiar with the system, then no matter how much time you have in advance, I think you should still at least offer to provide some pre-generated characters. I used to book the guests for our old Actual Play podcast, and I would let them know that we would have pre-generated character sheets available for them. If they wanted to work with me in advance to figure out their characters, I would be happy to do that, and we'll talk more about that process in a minute. But that was completely optional, and it was important to me that those guest players understood that nothing was required of them before they arrived for the game. Now, some players were interested in helping craft their character. In those cases, I'd usually give them a rough description of the races, classes, and backgrounds, and let them choose what they liked, and then I would go and build their character myself. There was actually only one time where somebody who'd never played the game before said, "No, it's cool, I'll read the player's handbook and figure out what I want to play." But that's an extremely uncommon experience for people who aren't already deep in the paint on D&D. And if somebody isn't at that level yet with the game, and especially if they're just joining for a session or two, then it's frankly unreasonable to assume somebody will take the initiative like that. Now, if someone is familiar with the game, then how they create their character is a lot easier to figure out and a lot easier to communicate. The question instead becomes, how much freedom do you want to give that player? If you have the time to do so, you might want to get together with the guest player in advance and watch them roll their stats. Or Maybe you just want to tell them how they should create their characters, and then you're okay with them just showing up with whatever they come up with. It depends on how much control you want to have over what sort of characters your players come up with. For me personally, I don't tend to care that much about policing somebody's character creation. If a player knows what they're doing, then I'm happy just to let them roll up their character on their own. I don't even care about watching them roll for their stats if that's how they want to generate their stats. It just doesn't matter to me that much. That being said, obviously you might not feel the same way, especially for a new player if you're not sure whether or not you can trust them to create their character in the way you'd prefer. I know this is why a lot of GMs would prefer their players, or at least their guest players, generate their stats through either the standard array or point buy rather than random dice rolls, because it's a lot harder to cheat that way. Likewise, you might need to tell your player that certain classes or races or backgrounds or spells or whatever are off limits. Normally you could do that during a session 0, but you didn't get one with this player. But this can be easy enough to solve. Just message them the basics that they need to know about the setting or the optional rules you're using. Don't go overboard. Focus on only the absolutely essential elements they need to be aware of. And that's easier than ever to do if you sign up for today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that allows you to create articles detailing the various aspects of your world. Nations, factions, monsters, magic items, and then you can share those articles with your players so they can read about your world on their own time. World Anvil also offers subscriber groups, which is a way to show or hide certain things from certain people or groups. Just like you can invite guests to your game, you can also invite guests to your world. World Anvil also has a co-author feature, so maybe you want to conspire with your guest player and share some secrets, and more on that later, so you could make them a co-author so you could work together behind the scenes. And World Anvil is offering a terrific discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you'll save 51% off of any annual membership. You didn't hear me wrong, that's 51%, that is more than half off. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. So, how do you handle the other topics that usually come up during a session 0? Like, what about lines and veils? Well, I have to be honest. This is a situation that I don't really have a definitive answer for. I haven't brought a guest into one of my sessions in years, since long before I started properly integrating safety tools into my games. So the advice I'm going to give here is somewhat untested. First, I think it's reasonable to ask your guests for their lines and veils and/or send them a consent form. Gather the information you need to run the best possible game for them. Likewise, let them know what lines and veils the rest of your party has, so they know how they should behave at the table. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. When you share your guests' lines and veils with your other players, they're going to know that those are the guests' requests. And generally, the goal of collecting consent forms and lines and veils separately and presenting them to the group anonymously is to keep anybody from knowing which players requested which topics to be off limits. To demonstrate what I mean, let's give an example. I'm going to try to do so without treading into any extremely common real-world phobias. So let's say that your guest has a phobia of dogs. They don't like dogs. Dogs creep them out. They don't like how little they are, how they have too many eyes and too many legs, how they crawl on walls, how they spin webs, all the things that we know dogs do. They don't like them. So they say, hey, could we please have no dogs in this session? They creep me out. So you take that feedback and that's good for you to know. So you don't have any dogs in this adventure while your guest player's at the table. But you also want to make sure your players know not to include any dogs when they're playing with the guest, especially because one of your players is a druid who loves to turn into a giant dog, and another player is a drow cleric who worships Lolth, the dog queen. Now, when they all sit down to play together, your players are going to know that it's specifically the guest player who made that request. And while I certainly hope your players will respect the boundaries of your guest player, especially around something like a phobia of dogs, which, as we all know, is always referred to as one of the most common phobias, we all know this about a fear of dogs, you know, they're still going to be aware that the guest specifically made that request. And I could see that potentially leading to some awkwardness at some tables. And I want to be clear, I don't really know what the solution is for this, except of course for the obvious one. Talk to your players like they're adults, who you expect to be able to handle the bare minimum of courtesy toward another human being. Ask them not to be weird about the fact that your game will be dogless for like about 4 hours of gameplay, and then things can go right back to the way they used to be once you're no longer playing with a guest player, once you're no longer playing host to someone who has generously given you their time. But this actually circles a piece of advice that I guess I'm taking for granted. You should tell the other players that there's going to be a guest at their session. In Thursday's Critical Role Demystified video, I talked about how it's partially the players' responsibilities to make sure they're not wasting time before introducing their guest stars. And multiple people pointed out a clip from just a couple days ago on the Critical Role YouTube channel that actually ties into this topic. There are no spoilers here, nothing revealing anything about the current campaign, but they were talking about how some guest players they brought into the game It sounds like at least some of the time, the cast of Critical Role doesn't know there's going to be a guest player until literally the moment the guest shows up in the middle of the game and walks onto the set.
To a certain extent, like, Marisha usually knows because, her production team has to coordinate schedules with the actors, though won't have more information beyond the fact that we're bringing these guests in. We try and keep them very separate and have call times staggered in a way so where the players have begun recording, they can come in and arrive after the fact and kind of sit in to hang out. If it's not that big of a deal, then we can be a little more lax, but that's the intent when we do sort of like guest crossovers to surprise the rest of the players. So yeah, it's a challenge, but our production team does a really good job of reaching out to folks and figuring out what scheduling and timing works for the episodes and who's available and make sure that we can do it in a way that makes sense. And then we feel it out from there.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, it doesn't sound like this is the case with every guest, and it seems like in the episodes I'm currently watching and reviewing from Campaign 1, we're in an era where a lot of these guests are known to the players. The moment a guest is introduced, the cast cheers, they point to where the guest or guests will be sitting. Usually Matt isn't even done saying, "Can we bring in our guest?" before Travis shouts, "Get over here!" like Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, except if you were grabbing his best friend and pulling him into a surprise party. So it seems like this isn't always the case. It's like a sometimes thing. Second, this is a situation that is primarily possible because Critical Role is a show filmed in a studio. They can bring in guests and have them wait in the green room out of sight of the players, something that is much more difficult when you're running a game at your kitchen table, unless you ask your friend to, wait in your bedroom for anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour and a half before texting them to come in and join the game at the opportune time. Third, again, they've got a crew, they've got call times. By this point in the show, their guests are getting paid for their appearances, so they probably don't mind as much if they just sit and wait for a while before they hit whatever arbitrary point in the story Matt had already predetermined will be the moment when the guest is introduced. And I'll admit, there have definitely been some times where the guest being a surprise has led to a truly incredible reaction. And those moments have only been possible because the players didn't know there was going to be a guest with them at the table. Heck, the first time Ashley comes back to the game just a few weeks after she'd been written out, it was a great moment because the players had no idea that she was even there. They didn't even know she was in town. That being said, with all these caveats out of the way, don't do this thing. Okay, maybe this isn't a never thing. I can definitely imagine scenarios where you could arrange a home game in such a way where you could work with the guest player and surprise your players with a guest joining mid-session. I've actually been in that situation before, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. And of course, if you're bringing in a collaborator or a co-conspirator more than a typical guest player, it might be especially tempting to find a dramatic way to surprise your players with your guest. But again, more on that in a minute. But in general, I definitely don't think this should be the typical way we think about bringing guest players into our games. Look, Critical Role is a D&D game. They are really playing the game, despite what some people seem to think, but they've also got a support team that can help them handle logistics like this. They're putting on a show for an audience, so Matt is partially keeping these secrets to make sure his players' reactions are authentic, and to make sure that they're actually doing what they would want to do in the game. And there are probably some guests where, if the players know they're there and what character they might be playing, it could spoil where they're going to wind up in the course of this session. And Matt really likes to reinforce his players having their own autonomy, their own choice to do whatever they want to do during the session without any outside influence. But this is where I think I differ from Matt, because I would much rather my players understand what's expected of them. I want them to know that we are going to have a guest, not because I trust them not to metagame, but because I hope they do a little bit. I want them thinking, oh, we should pick up on whatever clues the GM is laying down so we can make sure our guest is introduced right away. And if I'm a player and we have a guest at the table, then I am far more likely to follow the GM's railroad as best I can, at least up until the moment where we get paired up with the guest PC. Because that's just polite, you know? And your players are fellow storytellers, just like you are, so it's okay to sometimes let them in on your goals, even if it's as simple as, we have a guest, let's make sure we're welcoming them into the game. Again, there are probably ways you could have a fun surprise guest moment in your games. In fact, I've actually done it. I've had another player on my laptop Skyping into a home game. They were a former player in the campaign, it was that example from earlier. And the moment I got the players to the point in the story where they could meet up with the guest, I spun my laptop around and revealed that this player had been on my screen the entire time. They had no idea that she was even going to be part of the game. That's the thing. This can be done well every once in a while, and you should feel empowered to try this sometimes, because trying fun theatrical moments in your game is a tradition in this hobby. It is awesome. But this should absolutely not be the only way you introduce a guest player. But whether or not your regular players know there's going to be a guest in the game, in fact, especially if they don't know, especially if you're not going to tell them in advance, then it is absolutely on you to bring the guest into the game as soon as possible. Like, this is just not negotiable. Your players, including your guest players, are people with busy lives. They could be doing anything with their time, and they chose to spend it with you and your players because they wanted to play a game. And if they're not going to be given the opportunity to do that for, an hour or two as your players fart around doing stuff that absolutely could have waited, then your guest player is going to wish they had just stayed home and played Baldur's Gate 3. At least that way, they'd actually get the chance to play D&D. Like I said, when I was on the actual play show, I was responsible for bringing in the guest stars, because we had a different guest with us in every adventure. And our GM wouldn't necessarily tell us, the regular players, how we'd be meeting the guest star. He would take the guest star aside and tell them where they'd be popping up right before the game started. But then, usually what would happen is, we'd almost always meet the guest star within the first 5 or 10 minutes of the game. Maybe 15 minutes at most. In Critical Role episode 43, when Kasha and Zara returned to the campaign, they were introduced after less than 10 minutes of gameplay. And like 5 of those minutes were the cast debating what they could do before one of the characters actually showed up, because they wanted to spend time with those guests. They were kind of twiddling their thumbs. So I would actually argue they could have been introduced even earlier. I know game masters like to think about their games as sacred, elaborate, carefully crafted, and precious gems of realism, but for real, it's not that complicated. We're all just playing a game, and you invited a friend to come and play the game with you. Don't make them sit on their hands and wait to play the game. Now this actually brings me to another important question, one that you may not have considered asking your player. But what do they hope to get out of the game? What do they want to do? As I've said before, I think guest players tend to come in 2 flavors. Either they want to be a badass, or they want to help support the other players and make them feel more badass. Now to be clear, I don't actually think this should change how much focus you put on the guest player. They're still a player at your table, and just like any other player, you should give them an equal share of the spotlight, and let them do awesome stuff. And I think most players do come to the table to be a badass. Usually a supportive player is just a game master who doesn't get the chance to play very often, because they tend to easily fall into the habit of supporting the players because that's what they do with their NPCs in their own games. But if you realize that your guest player is less interested in being a badass and more interested in being supportive, then that can impact how you prep your game. For example, one time when I was a guest player, the GM gave me a magic item during the game, and I remember thinking, hey, I don't need this. It doesn't make sense for my character to be the one to get this item. So the first chance I got, I passed it off to one of the regular players, because they could make better use out of it. And I kind of wish that my GM had known that's what I was going to do, because it might have actually impacted how they ran the game, and that might have saved them some wasted work. Now there is a third reason a guest might be at the table, and that's to conspire with you. They're not just a random guest player, they're actually an ally in your shenanigans. We've seen this come up a couple of times on actual play shows like Critical Role, but it would be hard to discuss those without spoiling some major twists. But my favorite example isn't a spoiler, because it never actually happened. During Campaign 2 of Critical Role, it looked like the party might do a bit of work for the local government, and potentially could wind up in the middle of a political intrigue campaign. So Matt Mercer called up Matt Colville and recruited him to play a spy master that the party would work with. They had lunch discussing it, they traded emails, Colville wrote up a backstory and an org chart, and whenever the party got to the Ogden Trust, Colville was going to drive up, from where Colville lives, which is south of LA, up to Burbank, north of LA, which is 40 minutes without traffic, but could take up to 2.5 hours if he wants to get there before the game starts at 7 p.m. So you know he was fully on board with this plan. And he was basically going to play, in Matt Mercer's words, a guest NPC. But then, no spoilers, the party went in a wildly different direction, and so those plans fell by the wayside. Similarly, when Matt Colville launched his own actual play show, one of his regular players was basically playing a temporary character who was about to go through some very strange, supernatural funny business, and basically became a problem for the party to solve, heavily inspired by a Star Trek episode of the same premise. And while that wasn't exactly a guest player, it was exactly the kind of thing you can get up to with a guest player if they're down with it. You can recruit them to help enact your shenanigans and unleash them on your players. Again, this is something I'd recommend doing in moderation. After all, if every guest player is secretly in on some conspiracy with you, then it's very quickly going to lose its impact the next time you try to pull the same trick. But there is something really cool about conspiring with a guest player, and if it sounds cool to you, then I definitely recommend you try it with another guest player in your own games. We have one last aspect of guest players to discuss today, and this is something that I've seen come up a lot with guest players in D&D games. Sometimes, a lot of the time, the party will really enjoy playing with that guest, and they'll ask the player to come back as a regular. It happened in Colville's livestream. Their first guest wound up being a permanent fixture. Even in Campaign 3 of Critical Role, the campaign opened with Robbie Damon guest starring for what wound up being 16 sessions, and there was an enormous outcry from the audience for him to stay on and join the main cast as a regular player. And that was a huge deal because the fans of Critical Role hate change. And speaking anecdotally, when I ran my first Tyranny of Dragons campaign, I brought in a guest star and he wound up becoming a permanent player. Then, a bit later, I brought in another guest star, and he also wound up becoming a permanent player. Look, that campaign was a mess. I made a lot of mistakes, the players made a few mistakes. I'll tell you the whole story some other time. But in another group, when I played Dut the Faithful, a dragonborn cleric who guest starred in my friend's game for a few sessions, I got the same offer. Do you want to join the campaign full time? I said no, it just wasn't something I had the bandwidth for. After all, it was December 2019, and I knew that 2020 was going to be so busy. I wasn't going to have time for all my hobbies, and still fit in a full-time job that I was definitely still going to have in a few months, and plan a wedding that was definitely still going to happen in 2020. So this is something to keep in mind as you're inviting guests to play in your campaign. What's going to happen if your players love that guest player and ask them to stick around? Are you okay with adding another player to your game full time? In theory, you probably like the person well enough to play with them at least once, and you at least think it's possible they'll get along well with your pre-existing players, so this shouldn't be completely shocking if it does happen. But, you know, just be aware that it is almost definitely going to happen. But this is a big topic, so let me know in the comments, is there anything I missed on the subject of guest players in D&D games? Have you ever had a guest player in your games, or been a guest player? How did it go? What do you wish you'd known? Let me know in the comments below. Actually, on the subject of what it's like to be a guest player, as I said, we're going to talk about that in a separate video on Thursday, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, make sure to like and subscribe, ring the bell, support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships or Ko-fi if you're interested in Able, join my Discord to hang out with other awesome people, and sign up for my newsletter to get the occasional update. Click here for a video about whether or not you should ban feats in your games. Until next time, play fair and have fun.